Last week, I released a video examining a general rough outline of the history of Italy from 1870 to 1918 and the youth of Benito Mussolini, up to when he broke from the Italian Socialist Party and founded his own movement, the Revolutionary Fasci. This video will cover the 4 turbulent years in Italy from 1919 to 1922, the Biennio Rosso and Biennio Nero, and how Mussolini seized, or was given, the reins of power. It is generally imagined that Mussolini and his blackshirt thugs instigated street violence for several years and then marched on Rome to seize power. But is this really the case? In reality, this is a gross simplification of the big picture. Mussolini was only able to seize power, and Italy loved him for it, because he offered a restoration to order, an order that was already deeply disturbed by socialist strikes and violence. Mussolini's fascist movement was a response to instability created first by socialists pushing for a Marxist revolution, as the Bolsheviks had recently done in Russia. To give another comparison, the Italian Biennio Rosso was about the same time as the Bavarian Socialist Republic in Germany and the Spartacist League revolt and the Freikorps reaction, involving the same political ideologies. Or, in terms more resonant to our modern American memories, think of the George Floyd BLM riots of the summer of 2020. Now imagine that lasting for 4 years. The northern industrial triangle of Italy, of Milan, Turin, and Genoa, was most affected by the socialist disturbances. Turin, with more than 200,000 factory workers making up nearly half its population, the cradle of the Risorgimento, had become the capital of Italian communism. Throughout Italy, socialists often refused to transport soldiers, police, or priests by train. One station master overrode this, and in retaliation, Milan had imposed upon it a railroad strike lasting 13 days. In his autobiography, Mussolini reported, quote, "Conditions even reached a point where the Minister of War in those liberal days had a circular distributed advising officers not to appear in uniform in public, and to refrain from carrying arms in order not to be subjected to the challenges of gangsters and hoodlums." End quote. The liberal conservative government inspired little patriotism and did not radiate stability. Indeed, between 1914 and 1922, Italy had 8 prime ministers, on average 1 per year. In March 1919, in the Piazza del San Sepolcro in Milan, where the communist grip was strongest, Mussolini gave a speech founding the anti-party, Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. The Fasci's manifesto program expressed a desire for such socialist principles as the 8-hour workday for all workers, minimum rates of pay fixed by law, participation of the workers in the running of industry, and the putting in order of all transport industries, and old age pensions at age 55. Mussolini had become a nationalist, but never did completely cast off his socialist principles. By not restoring order, the Italian government left an opening for Mussolini's fascists to do so. Arditi, fellow Great War shock troop veterans, and squadristi, the infamous blackshirts, were the muscle of the movement. An example of early fascist violence was on April 14, 1919, when they broke up a socialist strike in the Piazza del Duomo of Milan. In retaliation, the next day, 10,000 to 20,000 socialists marched on the headquarters of Popolo d'Italia to burn it, but were stopped by several hundred fascists with police assistance. In return, the fascists then marched on the Milan Avanti office and burned it. On April 18th, Mussolini wrote in Popolo d'Italia of the attack, quote, "They were not reactionaries, they were not bourgeois, they were not capitalists, those who moved in a column. They were people, genuine, authentic people." The Italian Socialist Party, meanwhile, was regaining the membership which it had lost during the war. It went from 71,000 in October of 1919 to 220,000 in January 1921. In the November 1919 elections, the Socialist Party won 1.76 million votes and 156 seats in Parliament, making it the single largest party. The Fascists, however, did not win a single seat. Mussolini received a mere 1.5% of the votes in his own district. Though, as the majority socialists would have taken the lead in Parliament, when the king was about to make his speech to open the new Parliament, the socialists marched out, singing the Hymn of the Workers, the Red Flag, and the International, demonstrating still their preference for revolution over parliamentary coalition compromise. In January 1920, the Socialists imposed a week-long strike on telegraph, telephone, train, and postal services throughout Italy. The strikes increased over time, with 1,860 strikes by 1.5 million workers in 1919, and more than 2,000 strikes by nearly 2 million workers in 1920. These strikes crippled the economy, in 1920 destroying 1/3 of the hay crop, 1/5 of the grain crop, and 1/4 of the grape harvest. The historical context explains why Italians turned to Mussolini in such chaos. At the Second Fascist Congress in Milan in May 1920, Mussolini declared the fascist movement was, quote, not against the proletariat, but against the Socialist Party, so long as it continues to be anti-Italian. Only collaboration between the productive proletariat and the productive bourgeoisie can succeed in advancing civilization. We must not sink the bourgeoisie ship, but get inside it and expel its parasitic elements. Fight then all parasites, those of the Socialist Party, who are all just a bunch of evil shepherds, and those in the bourgeoisie, the bureaucracy, and the civil service. Also at this Congress, Mussolini first hinted that fascism could coexist with Catholicism. As he wrote in his autobiography, quote, I affirmed the necessity of condemning the unfruitful conception of anti-clericalism. That tendency not only kept us in a situation of moral inferiority as compared with other peoples, but also divided the Italians in the religious field into various schools of thought. End quote. On the other hand, the Socialists, faithful to Marxism, remained hostile and irreconcilable with the Church. Concerned by the socialist destruction and disturbance, Italians continued to turn to the fascists for the order that the state police would not enforce. Mussolini wrote, quote, wherever there popped up a vexation, a ransom, a case of blackmail, an extortion, a disorder, a reprisal, there would gather the fascist squads of action, the squadristi. The fasci of Milan began to make the public services operative despite the general strike. To crush a strike, the government was powerless, but a new power had been substituted for the government. End quote. Fascist chapters went from dozens throughout the country to hundreds, and from thousands of members to tens of thousands, and up to over 200,000 members by 1922. While fascist violence is made much of, and indeed the fascists themselves bragged about it, it is worth remembering that the potential communist alternative was expressly more destructive. In January 1921, the Italian Communist Party was founded, supported and directed from Moscow. Mussolini wrote, and his estimate was not far exaggerated at the time, and was soon surpassed, that in Bolshevik Russia 2 million had been executed, and 2 million more imprisoned. Italian Interior Ministry figures report that from January to April 1920, violence between fascists and socialists led to the death of 102 people, 25 fascists and 41 socialists, and 388 people were injured. During the month-long November election campaign, there were 105 deaths, or 3 a day, and 431 injured. Notably, on the 23rd of March, 1921, an anarchist bomb exploded in the Milan Diana Hotel Theatre, killing between 18 to 23 and wounding between 80 and 200. I found 3 different sources that gave 3 different figures, but it's all within that range. Historian Robert Paxton states that, quote, having unleashed their militants in order to name democracy unworkable and discredit the constitutional state, fascist leaders then posed as the only non-socialist force that could restore order, as if Italian democracy was working before and if not for the fascists, which is simply and clearly not true. Mussolini was one of the first statesmen to make successful use of mass rallies and mass media, speaking to thousands packed in piazzas from balconies and hundreds of thousands in the newspaper, having learned the value of and skill for reaching the masses from his experience as a journalist. Mussolini drew upon his experience fighting in the Great War to speak of the struggle to defend Italy against communism as a war, that Italian fascists must, quote, destroy the enemy in all his shelters, in all his trenches. In a speech in Milan in June 1922, Mussolini explained the relation between the fascist movement and the common worker as understanding and cooperative, not antagonistic, as the communists would have them, and us today, believe. Quote, should we abandon this class, which is neither vile nor intractable, and allow them to continue to be exploited by the red demagogues? "No, we cannot allow this. If we truly want to make the nation great, then we cannot ignore the working classes." End quote. The common claim that fascism was a bourgeois defense of capitalism is a communist myth that collapses in the face of evidence. In November 1921, Il Popolo d'Italia census reported that 24% of fascists were agricultural laborers, 15% factory workers, 13% students, 12% owner or tenant farmers, and the rest a mix of shopkeepers, traders, professionals, and factory owners. Nearly two-thirds had served in the war, which also meant that they were young. Mussolini's fascist syndicalism was a national socialism, reconciling three elements: the nation, production, and the interests of the working classes. Concerned by the rapid rise of socialism, and perhaps reassured by the failure of fascism in the November 1919 polls, the government as well as the people warmed up to Mussolini. Prime Minister Francesco Nitti sponsored fascism and helped keep it alive, seeing it as a useful tool in combating socialism. In April 1921, Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti invited the fascists to ally with his party to form, for the May elections, a Blocco Nazionale to present a united front against both socialists and the Catholic Popolare Party. The former because they were a threat to the state of Italy, the latter because their stubborn loyalty to the Vatican made cooperation difficult and frustrating. Street violence got worse before it got better. Historian Nicholas Farrell reports, quote, "On a single day, the 8th of May, a week before the election, there were 1,073 acts of violence committed in Italy by fascists and socialists. Only 396 fascists were arrested, compared with 1,421 socialists. These figures could mean one of two things only. Either the socialists were the more violent, or the authorities were more prone to ignore fascist violence." End quote. The truth, I think, is likely some of both. The fascists were more effective in their violence because many of them were Great War veterans, while few of the socialists were. And from early 1920 onward, the Italian army even provided the Fascisti with arms and ammunition. Unlike the 1919 election, the May 1921 election was a great success for Mussolini. The fascists won 35 seats out of 275 Blocco Nazionale seats. The Socialist Party won 122 seats, that's 34 less than they had in 1919, and the new Italian Communist Party won 15 seats, and the Catholic Popolare Party 107 seats. The newly elected fascists boycotted King Vittorio Emanuele III's address to Parliament in June 1921. In May, Mussolini had written in Popolo d'Italia, quote, "They shout, 'Viva la Re!' The fascists shout, 'Viva l'Italia!' Our symbol is not the shield of the House Savoy, it is the Fascio Littorio, Roman, and even, if you don't mind, Republican. Now faced with the issue of royal opening, disinterest is really the only fascist attitude." This aloof apathy was a far development from the hostile anarchism of his youth, and would soon morph further into active cooperation. In his first speech as MP, Mussolini attacked the socialists and defined the difference between his movement and theirs. Quote, "We do not even oppose experiments in cooperativism, but I tell you immediately that we oppose with all our strength attempts at socialism, statism, and collectivization. We deny that there are two classes because there exist many more. We deny that you can explain the whole of human history with economic determinism. We deny your internationalism because it is a luxury good which can only work among the upper classes, while the people are desperately tied to their terra nativa." When the new Prime Minister, Ivano Bonomi, held talks to halt the inter-party street violence in July, Mussolini participated because he believed that the violence was not surgical and was therefore counterproductive. Critical of rogue fascist violence, he wrote in Popolo d'Italia on July 27th, quote, "The nation came to us when our movement declared itself as the twilight of tyranny. The nation will reject us when our movement takes on aspects of a new tyranny." End quote. Mussolini and the parliamentary sect of the Socialist Party, but not the Italian Communist Party or even the mainline Italian Socialist Party, signed Bonomi's Pact of Pacification. Mussolini wrote the next day that, quote, "Fascism, having exercised its muscles, must now exercise its brains." The more aggressive fascist leaders of the squadristi, however, resented the pact, and Mussolini's movement was for a time in danger of splitting, as socialism had done many times before. On September 12th, 2,000 blackshirts converged on and occupied Ravenna to celebrate the 600th anniversary of Dante's death. They quickly became violent, however, sacking and torching socialist clubs and other targets. To regain order, Mussolini agreed at the Third Fascist Congress to withdraw from the pact in exchange for fascism to change from a movement to a formal party, the Partito Nazionale Fascista, the PNF. This confirmed him, not the local leaders, as the authority of the squadristi. I must also share here that it was during these years that Mussolini fought 5 sword duels with socialist rivals. The New York Times ran an article on the 16th of May, 1922, "Mussolini, Victor in a Duel, Fights for 40 Minutes with Another Italian Editor." I even purchased a subscription to the New York Times so I could read the whole article. It is lamentably short, but still pretty badass. Actually, I found so many other New York Times articles about Mussolini in the 1920s that I might have to make a separate bonus video just on them. Things came to a head when in late October 1922, a handful of aggressive leaders led their bands of fascists from various points around Italy to converge on Rome to put an end to the now normal chaos within the government and throughout the country alike. Mussolini had originally planned the march for November, but the leaders' impatience outweighed their obedience and loyalty, as was often the case, and they marched on October 27th. Equally important to the march on Rome itself were, quote, attacks on local government offices that had begun the previous night. Fascist squadristi took up their positions surrounding police headquarters, train stations, and telephone centers. The Italian army stopped the blackshirts at the gates of Rome, but violence did not erupt. The two sides fraternized. The soldiers gave the blackshirts food. The army in defense of Rome was around 28,000. Only around 26,000 fascists marched on Rome, and their lesser equipment and training made them no comparable match should hostilities have erupted. On the evening of October 27th, Prime Minister Luigi Facta asked King Vittorio Emanuele III to declare a martial state of emergency and order the army to repel the fascists. The king refused, accepting Facta's resignation instead. In letting Mussolini's blackshirts enter Rome, historian Nicholas Farrell posits, the king, quote, was in tune with what the majority of Italians wanted and felt they needed, end quote. Mussolini took a train and arrived in Rome on October 30th, and the king appointed him prime minister. Historian Robert Paxton speculates vaguely about why King Vittorio III appointed Mussolini prime minister following his march on Rome, apparently not considering that he was making a reasonable and calculated decision in preferring the fascists to the communists. While discussing the fascist regime, Paxton admits, quote, some degree, at least, of obligatory power sharing with the pre-existing conservative establishment made fascist dictatorships fundamentally different in their origins, development, and practice from that of Stalin. I posit that the communists' express intention for even greater control and social destruction was precisely why the fascists were preferred. Paxton also follows a common trend of criticizing and mocking Mussolini for the weak nature of the March on Rome, saying essentially it wasn't really a coup at all. But the fact that Mussolini's March on Rome could have been prevented by organized resistance does not mean that it was not a coup. In fact, how bloodless the coup was should be considered to Mussolini's credit, not to his shame. It would be half-blind not to recognize that Rome was ripe for the taking, but equally half-blind to not give Mussolini credit for taking the gamble. Rather than Mussolini's seizure of power beginning a civil war, like Lenin's before him or Franco's after him, it ended one. Though Facta had been the final incompetent prime minister before Mussolini's coup, Mussolini treated him with respect, assigning him a blackshirt escort from Rome to Palermo, his hometown, under the order that, quote, nobody should touch a hair, mock, or humiliate Facta. After having been appointed prime minister by the king, Mussolini was confirmed by a vote of confidence by the Chamber of Deputies in November 1922. 316 deputies voted for him in total, only 35 of whom were fascists. He received begrudging general support from both the Liberal Conservatives and the Popolari Party. With his newfound national authority, Mussolini suppressed both socialist and fascist street violence. In the next 2 months, 2,236 communists were arrested. In early 1923, Mussolini ordered a crackdown on dissident fascist violence, and in June he telegraphed prefects to repress inexorably illegality, whoever is responsible. When fascist street violence continued, it was opposed by a frustrated Mussolini. In a telegram in August 1923, Mussolini wrote, quote, "I declare that I want to liberate the militia, not from fascism, but from the party which is a vast, pitiful panorama of imbecilic bigots and interminable object of mirth and daily scorn on the part of all our opponents. Stop! For months and months, fascism has been the only unsettling element in the life of the nation. Government has confronted and solved formidable problems, while provincial fascism has never exited the bickering of the bell towers." Here, Mussolini directly condemned the bombastic violence that common history has associated with him. In his first year in office, Mussolini traveled around Italy more than any previous prime minister, and was the first prime minister to visit the island of Sardinia. His presence and actions won the attention and admiration of the civilized world. In May 1923, King George V and Queen Mary of England visited Italy and bestowed the Order of the Bath upon Mussolini, representing the British seal of approval for Mussolini and fascism. In 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt told an Italian ambassador that Mussolini was his, quote, "only potential ally in his effort to safeguard world peace, and Italy, quote, the only real friend of America in Europe." The ambassador, Guido Jung, was one of Italy's many Jewish fascists, by the way. After visiting Italy, Winston Churchill remarked that, quote, "it is quite absurd to suggest that the Italian government does not rest upon popular bases, or that it is not upheld by the active and practical assent of the great masses." And he addressed the British Anti-Communist League, quote, "The Roman genius impersonated in Mussolini, the greatest lawgiver among living men, has shown to many nations how they can resist the pressures of socialism, and has indicated the path that a nation can follow when courageously led." Mussolini's next step in securing power was the Carib Bill, a bold proposal to prevent the parliamentary deadlock that had so long defined Italian politics. Under it, 2/3 of parliamentary seats would go to whichever party won at least 25% of the votes, and the remaining third would be divided proportionally among the other parties. The Catholic popularity were among those forces initially opposed to the bill, but Pope Pius XI himself was willing to work with Mussolini. In exchange for Mussolini bailing out the Banco di Roma, which financed all Catholic organizations, and their newspaper, Corriere d'Italia, the Vatican pressured the leader of the Popolari, Father Don Luigi Sturzo, who was vocally critical of Mussolini, to resign. When the Carib Bill was voted on in July 1923, the Popolari abstained, the Socialists and Communists voted against, and the Liberal Conservatives voted in favor. It passed by 223 in favor to 123 opposed, giving the fascists 2/3 of the seats in Parliament, legally legitimizing the fascist revolution. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Please share your comments, your thoughts if you like. Next episode will be on the fascist regime itself and what Italian fascism and Mussolini were all about once in power. Thank you again. Take care. Until next time.